Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and my guest today is Melanie Hill. We're going to be talking to her about her new novel, JETT COOPER. It's fun to say, fun to read. Melanie, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
Hi, Paul. It's fantastic to be here. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you were able to make it. And for people who might not have recognized that accent, Melanie is joining us from down under in Brisbane, Australia. So it's super early in the morning for her. So we appreciate her getting out of bed just a smidge earlier than she usually does. I hope you have your coffee ready and you're all set to go.
I do. Even got
Oh.
a cookie on the front for you. So, I'm on
I was
theme
going to
for
say, for
today.
people who are listening on Spotify, it is a big bug with a cockatoo on this front on it. Okay, so for those familiar with the show, we'd like to start things off talking about anything we may have read or watched lately, if we liked it or we did not like it or we're totally indifferent to it. I will go first just to give Melanie a little time to collect her thoughts. So I watched three movies over the past couple of days. The first one is a drama, which script consultant Pilar Alessandro also consulted on. It is called Bob Trevino Likes It. I'm not going to go into the details, but I will say if you watch it, it is a little cringy in the beginning, but that is intentional. But things definitely take off from there. It is very heart-moving and very emotional, and definitely have a box of tissues nearby because you might get a little weepy as it develops. Second one, totally different direction. If you took Downton Abbey and you put it through an excuse me, put it through a filter of the movie Airplane, then you would get the movie called Fackham Hall. And I did say Fackham with an A because it is basically a satire of the prim British estate of the early 20th century. Lots of silly jokes, sight gags, and actually is a story to it. So that was entertaining. My wife and I watched it, and it was more entertaining than I expected it to be. But it was really enjoyable. Excuse me. And the third movie kind of sped through it a little bit was Wicked for Good, which just came on to streaming. Honestly, I kind of zipped through the songs because I was more interested in the story. But I enjoyed it. I also, after I finished it, I was thinking they could have made one movie and just had it be maybe 3 or 3 hours 15. This was, I think, just over 2 hours long, and I think the first one was 2 to 2.5. I know they're trying to do the show, but I think they padded it a little more than they needed to. I enjoyed it. Not, I think the first one was a little bit better, but this one was okay and wrapped everything up. And also, it was a nice take on kind of almost like a Rosencrantz Guildenstern approach to the Wizard of Oz. That's probably the best way I could put it. I enjoyed it. I don't think I need to see it again, but I'm glad I finally got around to watching it. So that's it for me. So Melanie, anything on you from the reading and or watching front?
Well, I usually have a couple of things going at a time, right? So be prepared.
That's okay. That's okay.
It's a bit of a list. So I co-host the Story Nerd podcast where we watch and analyze a movie a week to see how story theory is applied. So I recently watched Sicario and
Okay.
I really enjoyed it. It wasn't what I expected, but I really enjoyed it. So it was good to finally see that because that's been on my to watch list for quite some time. I'm reading the physical book Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales by Heather Fawcett, which is the third book in the Emily Wilde series. And I love that because it's fantasy elements, there's adventure and a very flawed heroine. So I'm really enjoying that. And it's fairy tales, and I'm a bit of a fairy tale lover, so that's really interesting. Last week, my copy of the Asian story structure book titled Spring Summer Asteroid Bird by Henry Luen arrived. So I'm in the third chapter of that. And I'm also trying to watch the latest Bridgerton series,
Okay.
but I struggled to find time to sit down and watch, watch that. I would love to binge watch it, but I just can't because of time. And I'm listening to the audiobook All the Light We Cannot See as well, which is handy when I'm in the car going to and from work. So, yes, I have a few things set on the boil at the time. I don't know what that means.
And we made you get up extra early today, so now you have even less time to catch up
That's,
on any of those.
that's
So,
right.
okay,
That's all right.
so what I want to do now is I'm going to read the about the author page from her book, Jet Cooper, a YA story. Melanie or Mac Hill's love of aviation and the sky started as a child. High above, hope I'm saying this right, Launceston.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, well done. Yes.
Launceston, Tasmania. As a 13-year-old air cadet, she experienced positive and negative for the first time on a caribou and was hooked. She studied English literature when she joined the Royal Australian Air Force. Her poems and short stories have been published in anthologies. As we said, she lives in Brisbane, Australia, with her family and works for Boeing when she's not writing. Jeff Cooper is her first novel, and she is writing a sequel about Ella's first year at the Flying Academy. Ella is a supporting character. We'll get into that a little bit later. And if you would like updates on her books, join her mailing list at www.melaniehill.au. All right, so Melanie, what I'd like to do is let's start out talking about you as a writer. I mean, were you always a writer? Were you a voracious reader as a child? Were you just kind of like, I'm going to write nonstop while I'm not obsessing about planes? Or was writing something you came to a little bit later in life?
Well, I always read, and we always had books in the house. And we even at primary school, we had a really good, little but good library. So I've always been a reader. But I wasn't a person that that grew up saying I always want to be a writer. I consider myself a poet first. So I
Hmm.
have always written poetry. And I came into prose writing a lot later in life. Like I would write creatively longer narratives, but poetry was really my first love and what I would do to, I suppose, unload or try to work out problems. I would actually write those things down in poetry form. So I've always considered myself a poet first. And it wasn't probably until about my youngest child, who's now 14, he's number four, and he was born, and my husband and I were talking about what would you do if if you could go back to work and it didn't matter. And I said, well, actually, I would like to be a writer. I would like to work on becoming a writer and learn how to write long form stories. So
Hmm.
take that all the things I love about poetry and take it and write novels. And so from that conversation, I started to look at how to do that. And I started with picture books, which are really difficult to write,
Hmm.
even more difficult to get published. And then I actually realized that I liked longer stories. I got into a couple of writing groups where we would focus on short stories, so really anything up to 5,000 words. And every short story that I wrote needed a longer narrative. So I was trying to pack, a novella or a novel into 5,000 words, and it would never work very well. So after that, I realized, no, I need to actually expand and write longer forms of narrative. It just seemed to come, I won't say naturally, I just have a tendency to want to tell longer stories. So
Was it difficult for you to make that transition from, the I don't want to say I guess the compact presentation of a poem to you have to expand it. Now you have to tell a narrative and you have to there's so many more details like with a poet or sorry with a poem you can just present what the emotion or what the I don't know the mood or the tone is through words, but with a narrative you have to describe things and we have to get into the characters' heads and we have to convey information via dialogue and you have to be descriptive about what's going on in the scene, so to speak. Was it difficult or at least very challenging for you to initially make that transition?
Oh, yes, yes. And that is why I now host a podcast on story theory, because that is the thing that really got me to learn how to write narrative. It's a craft, like writing poetry is a craft in and of itself. And I personally think, and I'm probably a bit biased, I think all writers should study and understand and write poetry because poetic device is really important in prose. And you would be amazed, having studied English literature, you would be amazed how many poetic devices are used in long form narrative. And if you know how to use it, it actually lifts your writing off the page. So I think poetry and poetic device applies to long form narrative, but like you said, there's character development,
Mm.
there's plot, there's subplot, there's all these things that you need to know as a writer that is more, it's a different style of craft. It's a
Hmm.
different type of craft that you need to know and understand. So it was very difficult, and that took me a very, well, long time. It took me a long time because I was working, I have kids, I was doing all that. I was doing all the life stuff as well as trying to learn how to write. And it did take me a long time. But I got there in the end, I think. And now it's like when I did start to discover writing theory and I really started to look at the craft, that's when things started to click into place for me. And I fell in love with writing. So while I say that I'm not one of those people that wanted to be a writer from a very
Hmm.
young age. Now that I'm there, it feels like it's something that I've always wanted to do. Even if I wasn't necessarily conscious of that in growing up, poetry really was my first love and how I got into writing longer stories.
Okay, I have to ask, feel free to say no, I'm not going to answer that. Do you have any of, I guess, what would be normally considered like really bad teenager poetry, like
Oh my gosh,
stashed away in a cabinet somewhere that will never see the light of day?
is it all, Paul? It's terrible. Have it all. I do not throw away anything when
Oh
it comes
my.
to my writing. And all of my, like, I have boxes and boxes of it. And, it's a back of receipts, the back of envelopes,
Wow.
you know, anything that I could grab when an idea came, I would write things down. So I have it all and I can't throw it away. And you're right, it is so cringe. It is just, it's just, it's just
All that
awful, but I
angst,
try
all that so much angst.
with no life experience. It's so,
Okay.
but
Well, I
I
I
think
think
it's really good to revisit it, right? And not just from a writing point of view, but it's who I was at that point in
hmm.
time. And that's very valuable. It's almost like a diary, but it's a diary in poetry form. It's so
I was going
bad.
to say that it also shows you how much you've grown as an actual person. That you're like, I can't believe I used to think this. That sort of attitude.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is. And yeah, it's why it will never see the light of day. And I just have to burn it before my children find it.
I was going to ask about that. Okay, so you started with poetry, and then you worked your way
Mhm,
towards prose and narrative. So let's get into your new book, Jet Cooper. So what
mhm.
was it? So I like to ask the guests. So in screenwriting, it's the elevator pitch, like that 5 second. It's this meets this, and you for authors, it's more like the cocktail party pitch. You meet someone and says, "Melanie, tell me about your book, Jet Cooper. What's it about?" And you would say.
I would say, well, Jet Cooper is Top Gun for teens, and it is about a boy called Jet, whose father enters him into a flying competition. But when his father dies, Jet has to work around his mother's ban on all things flying, so he can compete in the first Blue Wolf Junior Air competition, and will win a scholarship to the Elite Flying Academy. So that's what I would say if you asked me at a cocktail party,
Okay,
what the book
and I
is
will say
about.
that when we were setting up this interview, that I think it was you said that my new novel, Jet Cooper, which is Top Gun for kids, and that just grabbed me because I'm not even the biggest Top Gun fan, but when you said that, I immediately knew what it was supposed to be about. I was
Yep,
very intrigued to what extent is it Top Gun-ish? I mean, they're not, it's a teenage book, so he's not going to be in the military, but okay, flying is involved. And so I think that that is a great marketing tool because a lot of writers that they have to do their own marketing. So I think to use that, I mean, everybody knows what Top Gun is, and to say it's Top Gun for
hmm,
kids or Top Gun for teens, that really sells it. If everybody gets that mental image in their head, teenage Tom Cruise, so to speak, zipping around somewhere in a plane. So I think that really helped. So I think the big question is, what was the inspiration for the story? I mean, as we said, you've been fascinated with aviation and planes. You were in the Air Force. You worked for Boeing. Planes and flying a huge part of your life. So I can get that influence. But what was it that made you decide, okay, I want to write a novel, but I want to, and it's going to be about planes. What was okay, I think I want to write a YA novel. And what was it that kind of like got things rolling for you?
Well, it was just a throwaway line that someone said to me once. I might have been at an author talk or something, where someone said, "Write the book you always wanted to read as a child or a teenager." And that's really what got me thinking about that. And combined with the adage, write what you know, those two things came together, and the idea for Jet was sparked. And I couldn't get rid of, not that you want to get rid of ideas, but I couldn't put it down. I couldn't let it go because then I started to look for books about for kids that were fiction books about flying. There's non-fiction books, obviously, about planes and different planes, and there's historical stories, and there's a lot of biographical, autobiographical work by, astronauts, pilots, but there didn't seem to be much in the way of children's stories, which I would have read as a child.
Mm.
So that was really my inspiration and motivation, was to write the sort of book that I would have loved to have read as a 12, 13-year old who was fascinated by flying and aviation.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense because when I talk to screenwriters, especially those who are just starting out, and they always say, "Well, what should I write?" And I say, "Write something that you would want to watch." And so that's the approach that I take for my scripts. But I also like to say I write things that would appeal to 14-year-old me, but also to present day me. So that's like which applies to so many genres and so many styles. But I also think that if the writer is very much into the material, like they're a big fan of that genre or that kind of story, then you will see their love and interest in the subject reflected on the page. Because if someone's writing about something they're not really interested in, the work may come across as dry or boring, just like, oh, I just have to write this. But if someone who's really into that subject, as you are with flying, that you can see it on the page, that I could see it while I was reading the book, that she really knows her stuff. And she's incorporating it into the story, but not in a lesson kind of way. It's more like here are the details that are essential to the story, but they're also factual.
Oh, that's really good that you say that because it's a very technical world. And I
Oh,
tried
very much so.
to bring that in, but not isolate and make it difficult for people who are not as familiar as I am with that world. I
Hmm.
didn't want that to be a barrier to entry for people reading it. So I'm pleased that you found that it wasn't too technical or that you could find a way into the story and enjoy the story, even if you may not have not as much as a flying or aviation nerd as I might be. So
Well, it's interesting to say that because yeah, there were parts that got very technical. So I was trying to like, okay, I had to. Fortunately, there is a glossary in the back of the book that has a lot of flying terms. Oh yeah, it's a very back, like page 300. But it also explains a lot of things, which I think when they're first mentioned in the story itself, you explain what they are, but then they're repeated throughout the course of the story. But you also have 3 to 4 pages of aviation terms, which I wish I knew was there while I was reading the
oh,
book. Because it never
I
thought to
should.
me that it would be in the back. But I also want to say that the story walks a fine line between very detailed and informative, especially regarding the world of pilots and flying, but it's also at its heart a coming of age story. So how
Yes.
did you determine when to focus on either? I mean, because you have some very emotional scenes with Jet and his mother and his aunt and his best friend, but you also have passages where you talk about, okay, here's the route of the race that the contestants have to take in this flying competition, and here are some details about the plane, and you mentioned about the smell of the jet fuel, which I thought was a great touch because it helped flesh out this world for me. Kind of like I had a better understanding. Like one of the, I think the neatest details for me that they're in the hangar, which is a metal structure, and never even occurred to me as the building heats up, you can hear the metal, I don't know, adjusting to the heat of the sun. Like it bangs or it clicks or something like that. And I just thought it really puts me in that world. So this is going back to the original question, was it tough to, I guess, shift the focus from here's the emotional, here's the personal story, but here's a little more detail about the world that we're in regarding, flying.
Well, I wrote the action story, so the flying or the performance story first. So I
Okay.
got that nailed down first, and what I wanted to happen in the action and the flying scenes first. And then I layered in I suppose, the coming of age story, the maturation story. And I picked the points where that made sense to include that. And also the motivation for Jet. So hopefully the flying story and the coming of age story are tightly woven because Jet and his father used to go flying together, and it's really where he felt at home with his dad. And when his dad passes away, and that's not a spoiler, that
Hmm.
happens that happens very
That's in
early in
chapter
the
two.
books. It's in, so that's not a spoiler.
Mhm.
Um, but that is where he feels like he's still in touch with his dad. And as you know, like his father speaks to him. He imagines his father next to him when he's flying. So the stories are tightly woven
Mhm.
because Jet's motivation to fly is tightly linked to his maturation story and the realization that flying can be dangerous and that there are things that go wrong all the time,
Mhm.
and you need to be able to deal with that in some form and not necessarily lose your composure. But also, maybe his mum's got a point.
Mm. Yeah.
That so that is all tightly woven together. But the action story, so the flying story came first, and then I wove the maturation story in and around that.
Hmm.
And I used a lot of Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey to
Mm.
help me embed the emotional part of the story and that coming of age part of the story. So that's how I did that. And as for the world building, which is, the smell of the after and the buildings creaking, and the windsock moving,
Mm.
they're all things that I have experienced myself. So they are all things that I, from my world, that I've tried very hard to layer in and give people a sense of what that's like, because it is a very all-encompassing feeling and an encompassing world, especially being in the Air Force when you're dealing with aviation. And I've been very lucky to be posted to lots of flying squadrons. And so these are all the things that you do on a daily basis that
Mm.
you probably don't realize until you sit down and think about what it's like to walk into the hangar, what it's like to walk outside onto the tarmac, and then to see aircraft taxiing and having them refuel. So they're all the things that I try to bring into the world that people may not be as familiar with, like the smaller details. Most people have probably been at an airport, but not necessarily really been immersed in that aviation world from a day-to-day experience. So I really tried to bring that into the world building when I was writing the story. And because like I said, not many people know about that. And if you're
Hmm.
not in aviation, it's not something that you would really think about. But that is part of the everyday when you work in that world.
I was just going to say that for the, I guess, the civilian or the layman who's reading this book, there a lot of these things are going to be new information that it's not anything you really think about, especially when you go to the airport. You're not thinking about, where do they keep the planes and how do they clean them and what's the, the fueling process like? It's these are things that we don't think about, but someone who it's part of their life that it makes sense that you would want to include it in the story, but you also don't go excessively about it. It's kind of like, oh, and this is what the fuel smells like, and here's what the building is going to be like in the sun. And you just kind of like, okay, that's there, but let's focus again on the characters who are in the hangar and the fight that they're having right now. And speaking of which, a key to any story is conflict. And oh, hold on. Jed Cooper has it in abundance that he has some kind of conflict with just about everybody. Now, did that require a lot of advanced plotting and strategy on your part? Plus, were you also looking for ways to have all of the subplots overlap? I mean, like you have his relationship with his mother and also with his aunt and also with his quotes unquote instructor Charlie, and they're almost going at it all the time. But also his best friend Ella, who's also a pilot. That there's always some kind of he's always butting heads with people, and I think that maybe it just he's of that age, so he's kind of like a rebellious young man, but he's also still maturing. So it's just was it challenging for you to figure out all of these relationships, but also to find a way to have them, we'll say, intersect.
Yes, it was, and the first probably five drafts of the book, Jet was a very passive character. He
Oh,
did not
wow.
do anything. He kind of everything happened to him. And so when I worked with a developmental editor, I had to really learn how to make him active and how to make him bring the conflict on himself. And so I then wrote lists for each character and what they could do, how he could interact with them and make conflict, and how their points of view would conflict with his point of view. So that was a very conscious thing. And as I mentioned, like studying story theory, like conflict is right the key
Hmm.
to our types of storytelling. And it's really important to have conflict. So everything that Jet touched had to have an element of conflict in it, even if he doesn't realize it. So
Mm.
there is a conflict in the story that he's completely oblivious to, and and it's with Knox. He's oblivious to that, even though there eventually is conflict there. So every character had to have a level of conflict with him. Even his Aunt Allie, who's his biggest ally in the story, there's points where she even says to him, you're being a bit, yeah, that person's right. You need to check yourself. Like,
Hmm.
even she has moments of not conflict like the other characters, but she does oppose him in some way.
Right.
So every character had an element of conflict and a different type of conflict. That was really important to me as well, to make sure that the conflict was different with each character. But also, in terms of obstacles, gravity plays a big part in the novel as well. And gravity is a force of antagonism
Hmm.
for him, even though it's not in the same way the human characters are conflicted or conflict in fights with Jet. It is still something that opposes him and stops him from getting what he wants. And so I thought about it as forces of antagonism, and how do these forces of antagonism stop him from getting what he wants to do at the scene level, at the sequence level, at the act, and then at the story level. So, and if you can't tell, I'm a planner. I am a plotter, and my background in the Air Force is as a logistics planner. So I love that. I love plotting, and you can probably tell by the way I talk about it, it's a very conscious thing for me to make sure that everything is working in that way. And if it's a force of antagonism, it has to have a clear force of antagonism and really influence the story. So yes, it was it was a very conscious decision, and there is lots of conflict. But I think that's, like you said, that's what a story is.
Hmm.
And there's external conflict. So the characters are all external conflict, but Jet's conflicted internally as well. So having that internal conflict in him was important. And understanding that from a character point of view about how do I show his internal conflict? How do I show him changing and maturing? And it's really that interaction with each of the characters. But before he acts or reacts to things, he needs to think and show a change in thinking. So I was very conscious about that as well when I was writing the story.
And I was also going to say, in terms of the different kinds of conflict, because there's man versus man, man versus nature, and I'm not sure if gravity would be nature or the supernatural, but these are definitely conflicts that you have to take into account. And as you said, that each conflict is different unto itself. That it's never the same kind of conflict that it is like with his mother, as opposed to with Charlie or with Ella or with his aunt. And I actually want to ask you, so the main character, he's also the title character, JETT COOPER. He is male, and his best friend Ella, who is also a pilot, and some might even say, without a spoiler, better than he is. So what made you opt to focus on a male protagonist? Because I would imagine they always say write what you know, and I would think that a female writer would want to write about a young teenage female pilot, but you made her the one of the main supporting characters. What was the decision behind that?
Well, that wasn't a decision. Jet just walked into my head.
Hmm.
Once I had made that decision that I would like to write a story for younger children about, or for, middle grade slash sort of young adult story, he just walked into my head. And there were many times when I actually tried to change him. I tried to make Jet a female character, and it just didn't work.
Hmm.
So I came to the conclusion that this was Jet's story, and this is the story that he wanted to tell, or he wanted me to tell for him. And and that's what happened. Um, and I really did try because, like you're thinking, that's what I was thinking. I thought, is that really something that I can do? Can I be that 14-year-old boy and write this and put myself in his shoes and write this story? I just also happened to be fortunate enough to be the mum of three boys who who gave me a lot of insight into what that may have been like
Hmm.
from like trying to put myself into their shoes. And so Jet is really a culmination of what I think, what I think goes on in their heads. So it was he just didn't want to change as a character. That this is his story to tell, and I told his story. And I think in answer to the question about did I want to write a female story, the answer is yes. And so that's why I'm writing Ella's story next, um, because she now has entered my head and said, "What about me? I think I deserve something. If Jet's got his book, it's now my turn." So they really have come into my head as fully formed characters who want their stories told. And I know that sounds a bit woo-woo,
Oh
but
no,
that's
no, not at all. No, they're.
that's
I have talked to many a writer who said with a strong protagonist said that I just came up with this character from the outset, and that's who they are. There's not many changes. I have to go
yeah.
back to I guess your sons being not editors, but I guess creative consultants, if you will. Did you like give them a chapter at a time to read, and they say, "Mom, no, he would not do this," or that yeah, that skews too young, that skews too old. Did you get a lot of helpful feedback, I guess, from the teenage boy perspective about developing this character?
A little bit. I got lots of eye rolls,
Well, they're teenagers; they're going to do that.
which I chose to interpret as accurate.
Okay.
Only because I thought if I was really wrong, they would have said, "Nah, Mum, you've got this wrong." But I got eye rolls, so I took that as, well, maybe that's a bit closer to the truth than they would like to admit.
Hmm.
Getting them to read things was very difficult. Like that was a struggle. Getting them to read my story. They read, they
Mhm.
just didn't want to necessarily read my story. Which I suppose I understand now that if I put myself in Jet's shoes,
Hmm,
he probably would not have wanted to read anything that his mum wrote anyway. So
of course.
I do understand that. But they were, well, it's funny. I laughed when you said creative consultants because I felt like it was unwilling creative consultancy.
No dinner until you give me feedback on my pages.
That's pretty much it.
Of course, of course. You had mentioned earlier that you came up with the action scenes first and then developed the emotional aspect of the story. While you were coming up, I guess, with the action sequence, was it always going to be a flying competition from the outset, or did it take you time to settle on doing that? And also, once you came up with that, did everything sort of fall into place, or were there a lot of changes along the way?
Well, the first few drafts, it was at the air show. So it wasn't necessarily, the story did not have a competition in it. It was actually a raffle. So when I say that Jet was very passive, I mean it. Like he didn't go flying. He was hoping to win the first prize in a raffle, which was a flight. So very,
That is
very
very
boring,
different.
very, very different. So the first, yeah, few drafts did not have a competition in it. And then once I decided that, or once I worked out how he could be more active, the competition made a lot of sense. So I decided that it was going to be a performance story, which then led to the competition, which then made everything so much easier because competitions have a very formulaic structure. Do you know, like so understanding that made everything else fit into place. So I did, once I made that decision, yes, it then became a lot easier to work out when things were going to happen and the flow of the story around the competition and the action of that story.
Okay, that's great. Without actually, maybe forget my question before that. As we said before, there's a lot of technical information and terminology. Did you ever think, or were you ever told, maybe by editors or maybe by your sons, saying like that's too much, or that you had, or that's not enough? We need more information, or were the feedback, was it more of a you need to explain things more to the reader, or you have to dial it back?
I got a lot of feedback about dialing it back because a lot of my readers are not in that world.
Hmm.
And so they would make, they're very nice to make, oh, it's very technical. And it was a real dilemma for me about, well, how far do I bring it back? How much do I leave in there? Because I, I want people to be immersed in that world
Hmm.
and give them an opportunity to learn about, different measurements, different how people talk. And it's not as technical as it would be in real life. Like even the radio calling is a little bit different. So it's not as technical in the book as it is in real life. So I have dialed it back. And I did get feedback that there's a lot of aircraft names. There's a lot of talk in there that took people a while to get into the book. But I also needed to balance that with the credibility of the world and being in that world. So it was a really fine line between leaving it in and taking it out. And I think I've done okay. I don't, but I don't know because a lot of people who especially read the first chapter, a lot of my non-flying writing feedback was that's very technical.
Hmm.
And I didn't think it was that bad. I did not think it was that much. But obviously, people new to the world
Hmm.
did find that there was a lot in there. So I tried to keep it, like I said, make sure it wasn't a barrier and
Hmm.
it gave you a sense of the world. And I think in my own mind, I justified it. I self-justified by going, well, if you were going into a magical world, like into some sort of, academy for wizards, there would be a lot of different things that you would have never heard of before.
Right.
And so I think in my own head, I did. justify to myself that no, there's certain things that need to be in there to make it authentic,
Mm.
so that people who know the world recognize it. And really, that's where I landed. I wanted people who know that world and who are aviation enthusiasts to recognize it. And I think that became the priority in the end.
Okay, I almost made a comparison. It's like telling someone, well, an airfield is just like Hogwarts. Exact same
It's,
thing, except it's planes and not magic. Without
yes,
giving too much away, I thought it was very interesting and kind of unexpected that Jet doesn't excuse me, doesn't necessarily get what he wants, but he does get what he needs at the end of the story.
yes.
So was that part of your original story when you were developing the emotional part, or is it something that it took you time to figure out?
I always knew, so I like bittersweet endings.
Okay.
As a reader, I like bittersweet endings, and I always think that leaves a, a longer lasting impression on readers. So I was very conscious in the way that I ended it to make sure that that was the ending. But that doesn't mean it's not a pessimistic ending
No,
whatsoever.
it is
Like
not.
it's no, it isn't. So, but I was very conscious of him getting what he needed and not necessarily what he wanted.
Okay, I love that. So usually I ask what advice the guest has for writers. Now, you could say writing for a YA audience, but because the subject matter is so near and dear to you, so what advice would you have for a writer who said, I love this kind of world? How would I translate that into a story that's accessible to people beyond the borders of that world?
Well, I think you just have to get it down first. Like you just have to write it first. And even as I was writing it, there were things that I would have to go and research to make sure that I had the correct terms, that I had the correct definitions of the flying terms, because it's one thing to assume you know, and it's another thing to make sure that you absolutely have it right, because people in the aviation world are very pedantic, so you need to have those things as right as possible. So write those things down and then test it with a people who aren't in that world. See what that threshold is to make sure that they have that you're not writing too much to exclude them, but they still get a sense of the story and they still get a sense of the world and they're not excluded from the world. So to go back to your previous question, when I got feedback from writers, that was one of the things that I asked, did it stop you from understanding what was going on? And the answer was always, I knew I was getting closer when the answer was no. It didn't stop me from enjoying the story. So getting that feedback and striking that balance was very important. So my advice would be write the world as you know it, and then just get some people, and I suppose they have to be readers more so than necessarily writers, just to get a sense of, does it stop them from entering the world? Does it stop them from getting a sense of enjoyment from the story? Because that's still important, that people enjoy the story, even if they're not familiar with the world that you're writing about.
Okay. So what have been reactions to Jed Cooper? I mean, especially from, I guess, younger readers, but also from adult readers. But I'm also very intrigued to know if you've had reactions from the flying community.
So a few people at work have read it, and their kids have read it, and they gave me good feedback. Now, I'd like to think that's not just because they know me as a person, but their kids are into aviation. So
Ah,
it to get that feedback from kids that are into aviation and like flying, that was very positive. I also had some writer friends who were advanced readers for me, and they took the book home. And I did not know that their partners were into aviation and their kids were as well. And so they really enjoyed the story. And I only found out after the fact that they were a what they call it, flying family.
oh,
So
wow.
that was really fantastic to get that feedback. as well. And this is going to sound really, my parents have read the book. So my mum is a big reader. My dad is not so much of a reader, and my dad has read the book.
Hmm.
So that was actually quite special for him to read the book for a start, and then to say that he actually really enjoyed it. And I know they're my parents, but still, their opinion does matter.
Of
Um,
course.
Yes, but no, the general feedback has been really positive, and I did get some of the pilots that I work with to read the flying scenes for me to make
Oh.
sure that they were as authentic and as like to make sure they were technically correct,
Hmm.
that I wasn't pushing a pedal when I should have been, pushing the stick, those kind of
Uh-huh.
things. And I did make one or two mistakes that they picked up, so that was really good, and they enjoyed it. So that was nice as well. That from a flying point of view and from a pilot's point of view, that they thought that it was enjoyable and they liked it. So the feedback's been quite positive, which is excellent.
That's great. That's great. Okay, so you said the next up, we're going to be focusing on Ella, who is Jet's best friend, and her adventures. This all takes place after the competition. Are you working on anything else? I mean, anything non-flying related, or is every book of yours is going to be somehow connected to flying and or aviation?
No, I did think about that, thinking about, being not specializing as someone who has aviation in the novels, and I did think about that. So that's sitting on the back burner. No, I have
Sure.
a fantasy spy. I love espionage and spy stories as well. So I've got a bit of a fantasy spy story. I'm about 10 chapters into that as well. So I've got that on the go, as well as just I've started the first chapter of Ella's story too. So I've got those two things running at the same time.
Okay, I was afraid you were going to say, "Yeah, I'm really into speedboats now," and I can imagine what your family's reaction is going to be to that. Oh no. Okay, so again, we've been talking to Melanie Hill, and her book is Jet Cooper. Melanie, where can people find out more about you and Jet Cooper and your website and all of your social media platforms?
So they can find out more about the book and where to buy it at melaniehill.au. And most of my social or all of my social media handles are at Melanie Hill Author. And I also have a weekly podcast called the Story Nerd Podcast, which I co-host. And people can find me and listen to how to apply story theory at storynerd.ca.
Is it, and it's called the Story Nerd podcast?
Yeah, oh, just Story Nerd
Oh,
Podcast.
Story
Yeah,
Nerd podcast.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Well, Melanie, thank you so much. This has been I'm going to avoid the lousy pun of the very high flying episode. Uh, but thank you so much for being here. And again, your book is Jet Cooper, and her site is melaniehill.au and at Melanie Hill Author on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook. And her podcast is a Story Nerd. Melanie, thank you so much for being here today.
No, thank you, Paul. It's been fantastic.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. And viewers and listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, please hit like. Feel free to leave a comment and subscribe. I like to know that people are actually hearing these. For social media, my screenwriting blog is maximumz.blog. This show is on Blue Sky at Podcast CWL. I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram, and that handle is at Pez Screenwriting, Pez Screenwriting. And you can check out my Go Ahead and Ask books. They're on Amazon, the ones about screenwriting and pie, two very wonderful things. Like I said, that's Melanie. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.